I'm Ashley Rooney from Lexington Remembers WWII. And today we have a very interesting man who survived World War II, but he started out as a crying baby with his mother traveling through war-torn territory. And what Sig Tullmann has done is, like many of us think we should do, he has begun to write down his memories and his stories so his family can understand what he's been through and what this world has been through. This makes the story really fascinating because he's gotten a lot of details and we will be very interested in him. So let me introduce Sig Tullmann, who's going to tell us about his life. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe to give you a perspective, I'm talking about the time period basically from 44 through 46, and then a couple of comments after that, because the change of the war in Germany really was 48, the Marshall Plan and the airlift that made a dramatic change.
That's right.
I was born in 44. By then, or 6 months later, the Allies had landed in Normandy in D-Day. My dad was killed in 44, post-Normandy landings since around end of July or August.
Wait a minute, can we sit back up? Your dad was fighting for which army at that point?
The German army.
The German army.
He had been lucky through most of the war in that he hadn't been posted to any front. He was, as I am, we are ethnic Germans whose families have lived and ancestors have lived in what is today Poland or Eastern Europe. There were several million folks that were ethnic Germans. The German military did not always trust those folks once they were in terms of assigning them to the front or certain locations, and that worked for both sides. It worked for the sides that weren't being pushed out into the war. So my dad really didn't go to the front. He had been drafted in 42. There was a little choice. It's in 42, but then didn't really get to the front till 44. I think right after the landings. I have his last two letters, so I have some precision in terms of dates.
Wow.
And his last two letters were written in July. The interesting thing about those letters is he was focused on detail unrelated to the war. It's like he was writing from a small town in the middle of nowhere. And he had sent his extra shoes, boots, a number of other things to my mother, and he had his bank book, which turned out to be critical after the war. He didn't smoke. He sold his rations. He had saved that money. And so my mother used to say, we lived off of that money for the first year or so after the war. By 45, by a year later, Germany is already divided into Allied zones. We end up in the British zone, and I'll go back of how we got there and why. My parents married in 1940 in Warsaw. There was a large community of Germans, both north and south, and within the city. My paternal ancestors were probably Dutch or Frisians. And if you've ever been to Warsaw or that part of Poland, it's like a billiard table. It's flat. The Vistula goes through. They have regular floods, so they brought the Dutch in to manage the water. That was one of the attractions. As I said, he was part of the Osttruppen or Eastern troops, and therefore posted late. He sent all this stuff back to my mom, and when I read through his letters, there is no reference to combat, but it had to be horrible because they were south, and by then the Allies had landed. 400,000 Germans had been killed after those landings. It wasn't precise, but it was killed by, it was American phosphorus bombings, fire bombings to clear out the remaining positions. So he He was killed somewhere near the end of July or early August. He was basically missing in action until 1951. We didn't really know whether he was alive or dead till then, which, besides the obvious emotional issues, were also critical for a widow to know is she a war widow or not, the way the German system works in terms of her rent or pension payments and whatever else. My mother wrote a lot of letters to folks that might have been out there, and some of our information came from a fellow who said, I remember I remember him, but I didn't remember him after these dates. He had been captured by Americans and had been moved to a prison camp. The other thing about, I think both sides, the Allies and the Axis, thought Normandy would be the end of it. There was an attempt, the problem was with Hitler's unwillingness to surrender. There was an attempt on Hitler's life in July of 44, and the general von Kluge, who was in charge of the Western Front, was a participant or supporter of that. When he was called back to Berlin, when that assassination attempt failed, when he was called back, he did not go back and killed himself at the front. He was replaced by Rommel later on. So this is middle of 45. I'm sorry, middle of 44. The Russians were still pretty far in the east. They hadn't moved west. Where we were, we would have, meaning in Poland, would have been one of the first places to be exposed. My mother, to her credit, saw things before many other members of the family. She says, I'm not staying. We're getting out of here. But they had, but remember, they were walking away from houses, from apartments. She locked her apartment, gave the keys to the super and said goodbye. That was it. So,
and she left with you as a baby?
With her mother, my brother, who was three at the time, and I was the infant. This is middle of 44. By then, my dad's already dead. She doesn't know any of this. But she gets on the trains, and we basically went directly west. Our destination, we had to go somewhere. And this was before the war had ended, so you still had rights and you could buy tickets as a German and whatever. You get on a train and go somewhere. Later on, as an official refugee by 45, you had to have papers and approvals. It got a lot more complicated. But her destination was to the sort of black sheep of the family, meaning he was the one who ended up marrying, my ancestors were German Lutherans, and the church, and especially the Lutheran church, was a major driver in those small communities and villages. Life was run around that church. You did not leave the church and marry a Catholic. You know? So major breach of cultural norms. My uncle, her brother, her youngest brother, Waldemar, at this garage, she was still alive till about 10 years ago. I said, how'd you guys meet? As well, we were sitting in a coach from school, and I threw a book over the sides, and he picked it up. And a typical kind of romance story. He left the church, which he had to do. They posted him as died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they married. And because the ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe, when the German troops moved in, had to sign up and get papers. You had to make valid that, yes, you're ethnic German, how many generations, and all those kinds of numbers. And there were ratings about what level of Germanness you were. And he got ranked pretty low because he had stepped aside. It was unusual in my family, but as I got to know others in more extended family, in some areas the intermarriage with Poles was more common than not, and those folks had a lot of difficulty at the tail end leaving, because one partner in the marriage was leaving their homeland, the other one was just leaving property. Wasn't there? It had been their homeland, and Germany wasn't home. It was just a place your ancestors were from. Um, so, but he, because of his designation, was put into a forced labor camp. And the forced labor camp was in Germany near Braunschweig. It was a large steelwork. It still exists today. It was Hermann Göring Steelworks between Hanover and Braunschweig, sort of in northern Germany, directly south of Hamburg, not far from Wolfsburg, where VWs are still made today. So he was there as a forced labor. So they had a destination, but because his brother was in the SS, he had contacts and he didn't live in a dorm. They had a small apartment. He got backed up because they must have had pretty good papers, because his wife told me, Czechia, that she was able to go during the war back to Poland and visit her parents and other kinds of things. So they had connections to have good documents to be able to do that. But that was now our destination. It was someplace to go to. We had no relatives anywhere else in Germany.
So that's where your mother went with you all.
That's where we went. It was basically a 2-day train ride due west. We basically went in a straight line. It was due west. From Lodz or Litzmannstadt, or Lodz is not far from Warsaw, a major textile town, not unlike Manchester, England, or Manchester, New Hampshire. During that trip, one of those many stories you hear as a kid, she said they were on the train and the trains had to stop frequently at night, darken the lights. There were bombing raids, so they'd pull off into a side rail. And it was one of those stops, and there were military on the train as well. And she says to her mother, she says, "That's Erhard." You can hear a voice, somebody talking, her youngest brother, the guy who was in the SS. And it's not clear that they had any choice about being put into those units. But she heard him. And she says, "Erhard, is that you?" And he says, "Yeah." You know, they came. She says, get off the train. It's all over. This is August of 44, about a year before it really ended. But it was over. And he says, "I get off this train, I'm dead, man. They'll shoot me." You know, so, because you'd be considered a deserter.
Right.
And so my mother said more often than not, she, like, even for her husband, she would visit and stuff. She said, "Well, I'll rip off some buttons on your uniform or do something." Don't even try. There was no choice. It wasn't exactly a freedom of action. So that's the last time she saw Erhard. Her other brother, Alfred, was a courier, a military courier, also killed. We have no information whether 44 or 45. So she lost her 2 brothers as well as her husband. All males that went in, and all males went in, except for the guy who was put into a forced labor camp. He ended up in the best row. He was harassed at the beginning and survived them all and died in Cleveland, Ohio, many years. So quite a character. And so that was our destination, and we got there. There weren't any extra, so we ended up moving in with them. And as my aunt says, "Here comes my favorite mother-in-law." Remember, they were this kind of thing in the family, with her daughter and 2 kids, and they're there with that set of twins, girls. But that was the pickup time, late 44, when the firebombing campaigns of German cities really picked up. And we were close to Braunschweig, which was a beautiful Brunswick. It's always remarkable to me how many Brunswicks there are in the US. Virtually every state has a town named Brunswick. I don't know why, but there must have been a lot of bridges. But Brunswick was a beautiful old city, but it had roll-eye cameras came from there, so it had some lens capability, some machine tooling capability, major target. And the major firebombings were there in August of 44. My mother said we were about 20 miles from there, but you could see the sky was just red all night. And so there were bombing campaigns. Lebenstedt itself was just a town built for workers. It was just apartment buildings. There wasn't any manufacturing, so it really wasn't a target. but everything around it was the steel works and this stuff. And she said, I'm the infant screaming in the basement. Everybody else is doing one of these. My brother said he does remember playing in the yard, looking up and seeing airplanes. And he said, there's these funny things falling out of them. They were bombs. Didn't know. She grabbed him and hauled him off into the basement. But my crying and my whatever else, at some point it got to be too much. And she timed it well. So one night she says, I can't do this anymore. She just walked out. I don't care. Kill me. She just left the basement, walked out, and she's all of a sudden was eerily quiet. It was all over. The bombing campaigns had stopped. Like, it was that kind of thing.
Sig, let me interrupt. How old was your mother at this point?
She was born in 11, so 33, 34. Yeah.
She was handling.
I know. When I think back of when I was that age, you go, oh my God, kind of decision you had to make, By, what is it? By the spring of, Hitler commits suicide in April of 45. And that sort of, now I think the German staff could surrender. He was out of the way. And the American troops came through from the west, rolling through, and we were up north. We were also very close to the major Autobahn between Berlin and Paris, the turnpikes. That's where materials moved across northern Germany. And a tank squad came into town, and people were asked to meet on the town square, come out. And it was she said it was a black squad. It was mostly black guys, or tank group. I don't know what their number was. I've never traced that kind of thing back. But she says there was one guy who thought the war wasn't over, and he had a hand grenade hidden behind his back, and people grabbed him real fast and hauled him out of there. But they were happy. They were happy that it was all over. So my brother tells me that he met a man who was in that squad, or one of the officers of that squad. He met him in Cleveland in the 60s. The guy was involved in a company, and they started talking, and he says, I was in that group.
Oh, really?
Talk about a small world.
Yeah, small world.
The let's see, where am I here?
You're with the Americans coming in.
We're in Lebenstedt. The bridge, or a place everybody had to pretty much go through, just because the rails went that way. And eventually, when it got to be after 45, and the refugees that hung in till the last days went, and we're talking about millions of folks, a couple of million people. It's one of the largest movements of people within Europe that's often overlooked or not known about, because these were all people who had been in Eastern Europe for hundreds of years. In Eastern Europe, the borders depended what day of the week. What they were Austro-Hungarian, they were Prussian, they were Russian, they were Poland didn't exist for 100 years, kind of as a defined country. Germany didn't exist till the 1871.
Yeah.
The states within Germany existed, but an entity, one country didn't. So a lot of my friends used to say, you were born in Poland, so how come you're not Polish? I said, well, it's because what you spoke at home and what your religion was and what your ethnic background that determined who you were, not where you were geographically or today. My birthplace, when I was born, was Litzmannstadt. 6 months later, or a year and a half later, it was Lodz. It was renamed again as a Polish city, as it is today. So this huge movement of people, the later they came, the more difficult it was. Remember, they had to go have a destination. You had to put them up. The law in the regulations in Germany after the war was, if there was a refugee and you had any kind of spare space, you had to put them up. It was not a choice of your kindness. So it was a requirement, and it took. And remember, most of the buildings in the big cities were burned out, so finding living space and food and all those things was extremely, extremely difficult.
But your family had living space with your aunt, right?
Or my uncle, briefly,
Right.
For about a year. Then we finally got an apartment because my mother left earlier. It paid off a lot of time in that before the big surges came. We were already in place. We got an apartment and ended up hosting several other members of the family in that apartment for lots of years. So I grew up with it was in a 2-bedroom apartment with about 10, 12 people living. So,
right.
The Berlin, the horror of Berlin is what happened as the Russians moved west.
Right.
Raping of all females of whole age range was common event. The one story of my mother's brother, who the SS guy said his wife was a beautiful young woman, and member family said, "Oh yeah, we used to see her. It was always on the arm of a different Russian officer. She was so good looking, in a sense. That saved her life probably, and that she was the prize for a few officers rather than being decimated." I met her in 1970 or 80. She was still alive then, but could not leave Germany because the rules. Her husband had been SS. If you were in that category, you were not going to emigrate. You couldn't.
Oh.
The U.S. rules were snug, except when it came to rocket scientists and a few folks that were moved out. There's some interesting story there in terms of tolerance of of things that were accepted because you wanted the brain power. But I'm wandering off the subject a bit. In the post-war period, after 46 through 40, that was the toughest time. Most of the Allies were focused on denazifying Germany, rooting it out. And then the reality of Stalin and the Russian front emerged. And the step one was closing down of Berlin. Berlin was a 4-power city. Every Allied power had a fragment of the city. And the food and fuel was brought in by trucks along the turnpike from the west. Stalin closed the border. Stepping back one more, where the end destination of our train ride to I'm sorry about the wandering off into things I'm forgetting. The end destination to our new place in Germany from on that train trip to my uncle's place, fortunately, turned out to be a place that ended up in West Germany. If we had gotten off the train 3 stations earlier, I would have grown up in East Germany. It was that close to the border. No one knew where the border was going to be. Yeah. And at that point, and no one knew that border was going to be the Iron Curtain. That was the control border. All the other borders were kind of soft. The borders between the French sector of Germany and the British sector wasn't an issue. You could just walk across. Again, a fortunate break.
No, you had the airlift going on this time,
well,
right?
The airlift is 48. The border was closed by the Russians. They believed no one could supply Berlin by air. They really felt they were going to try and choke it. And thanks to Truman, who pulled, there were like 2 U.S. airplanes left everything was pulled out. The military, everybody was gone. He brought stuff back. They built up a system of logistics that is still a miracle. Those planes were landing every 30 seconds in Berlin. No one thought you could do that. They found the guy who had arranged the Burmese airlift in the early part of the war, running something in Kansas City. It's a terrific story. And he was brought in to organize this thing. And basically it was a matter of getting enough airplanes and a plan and a schedule that could do that. The human side of that story is that many of these pilots were the same pilots that were throwing bombs 3 years earlier, were now throwing candy at the kids at the end of the runway.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah. In fact, I think Hershey ended up sponsoring a couple of those flights and packed it full of candy. It's called The Candy Bombers is the name of the book. It's a great story. But those planes flew over where we lived, and my brother, I was too young, but he says, I remember he could hear all day, just imagine airplanes landing every 30 seconds. So it was an ending roar, but they basically flew north from Frankfurt near Braunschweig and then hung a sharp right to Berlin because they couldn't fly over the east zone with enemy territory already. But it was the Berlin airlift and then the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was a significant statement because it says, no, let's not dismember Germany, which had been the plan after World War II. Turn it into a farm, remove the industry, remove everything else. Is we better invest in it. We need an ally next to the Russian front. And that was the huge change in military theory and political theory. And it rebuilt Germany. It was massive amounts of money, but politically had to be a difficult thing. I mean, think of today's newspapers,
Right.
But so these were very difficult choices that were made at an incredible time. When you think back now, it's easy to flip and to just kind of read about it and stuff. And you go, God, what that must have been like, though, to pull off. Things got dramatically better in Germany after that. Was people were building things. Food started to come back. But prior to that, it was pretty bad. There was, and I think meteorologically, I think 44, 45 was one of the coldest winters ever in Germany for years. We lived in the British zone. So my mom has her ID papers that are stamped by the Lord Mayor of Wattenstedt-Salzgitter, which was the rename of this region. And she, like everybody else, trucks would pull up, and they were any capable adult was required to work. They went into the woods to cut trees. The Brits took out trees out of the forest, hauled coal or raw materials that went back to the UK. They started to dismember. My uncle told me this. They started to dismember some of the steel mills, and haul them out. And there was a major, this is 48, 47, major uprising that people said, no, we can't do this. This is the death for this area. So it got stopped. And it ended up, I read about somewhere that it was Bishop talking to Bishop, kind of, help me on this. Yeah. The other interesting story involves Dresden. Dresden is called the Florence on the Elbe, which is the river that runs north-south. A beautiful city and a tragic city. It didn't, in February of 45, near the tail end, it was firebombed by squads of English bombers. There were no military installations, and it's quibbled about, but at least some 30,000 people were burned to death overnight during those bombing raids. And the church, the signal of the city, was this beautiful old church with a big cupola. It was finally reconstructed about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. No one thought it was possible, but they said between computer-aided design and because the stone was locally sourced, they could go back up and cut fresh stone. They were able to do that. And today, if you look at that dome, you'll see black stones and new ones, and the black ones are the originals. I think the most significant part of that, there's been, all German cities today have sister cities in previous enemy countries, typically Britain or in France and stuff. And there's a very strong annual festivals of getting a real effort made about breaking the old enmity apart. So the sister city to Dresden is Coventry. And a son of one of the pilots is a jeweler. He recast the cross on top.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great story. That's
a very good story.
They found remnants of it in the rubble. That you couldn't do anything with it. But I went to visit that place in middle of the 90s or something. And
talk about building bridges. That's a great thing.
Yeah.
Tell me, at this point, what was your mother living on? She had the cigarette money left over from your mom.
Well, you have bank. She had a little bit of a bank account. The real German social support structure started after the March, when the currency was redone. Germany always had a pretty good structure. So there were social payments. That's why a major influence was getting a clear notification that my dad was dead. So she was a widow, and I think that she never told me these, but I have to guess that was a war widow was a different. She had and her mother was with her as soon as the structure settled out. Probably had a pension from my grandfather, who was killed in World War I. But these were very capable folks. My grandmother, the joke was, my grandmother could make a grand meal out of 4 things she found in the hallway. She was a professional chef in her youth. And so we had a yard down. You could get a piece of land, you'd pay rent and grow. I grew up on potatoes that were grown in the backyard or down the field, or carrots and stuff. My mother very quickly ended up being of help at a farm in a small village not far away, about 4 miles away, because she would walk there with a little cart and pull us along. And the husband on that farm had come back, had lost his leg in the war, so he had some limit. My mother was very kind of aggressive, capable. She could grab anything and do stuff, and she worked there. So that was a source of fruit. And, as she said more than once, you never went hungry, so don't ever complain and stuff.
Oh, she must have been very proud of that.
Oh yeah, extremely. The burdens were, I think, less. Sure, there were financial burdens, but you lived off. There were also all the relatives in the U.S. who would send packages of food. Coffee was the most prized commodity, real coffee, and great black market item. You can get most anything with real coffee. It was never a family of like 1 or 2 people. It was an extended family. I lived with both grandmothers, a sister-in-law, later on an uncle who moved in. They lived in 1 bedroom. If they had chicken for dinner, there was a live chicken by a string tied to the kitchen table, and it was slaughtered, in the basement before dinner. So, we didn't come. Our stuff didn't come shrink wrapped, So. Yeah. But it worked, and maybe it bridges into why did we come to the U.S. or how most of my ancestors, there were waves of emigration from Eastern Europe. One major one was in the late 1800s. That part of the world was under the Tsar's rules, and the Tsar changed the draft rules, and you had to serve 5 years. And a lot of males left Poland and Russia and the Ukraine and came to the States. It was a huge wave of emigration. Then a second one, I think in 1910s and 20s, just as when the Depression hit, or just shortly before. So we had, on my father's side, they typically all came, they all end up in the same place. One guy arrives, says, I'm here. Everybody else goes to the same place. They were all New York and New Jersey. On my grandmother's side, one came to Cleveland, the rest of them followed. So when we emigrated to Cleveland in 1956, I had more relatives in Cleveland than I had in Germany, cousins and uncles, and so that's where we went. But I think it was the final notification that my dad was not coming back that made us go. Post-war Germany, for people who stuck out, did rather well. They did okay. They weren't. The country was rebuilding. We would have been okay. I wouldn't have had some of the I'm sure I wouldn't have many of the opportunities that I had coming here. But we weren't going from destitute to, and it wasn't that sort of issue. But for a widow with two boys, the U.S. seemed like a better idea. You didn't, especially in the early 50s. And my grandmother died just before we left, but she made my mother promise on her deathbed, "You're going." She might not, you're going. And so her brother was already here. The same brother who had been the black sheep, so to speak. They left in 51. So they were already in Cleveland. And her sister had come to Cleveland in 29. So 3 siblings reunite in Cleveland, Ohio by 1956. So
did she come through New York?
When we came,
yeah.
We came through New York, yeah, but it was not Ellis. We flew, Flying Tiger. We came under an emigration program through the Lutheran Church, and they basically chartered Flying Tiger, which was an air freight flyer during the war years and earlier years. It wasn't a commercial airline, so we flew from Hamburg, Stockholm, picked up some more immigrants, Swedish ones, through Reykjavik, Newfoundland, New York. So didn't have the dramatic entry in the port with the Statue of Liberties, but we had my uncle in Brooklyn. So I came to Brooklyn, and my uncle in Brooklyn took us out the night after, a couple nights. We drove down to the shore on Staten Island, not Staten Island, but on the Brooklyn side. You could see the statue, so we did get to do that.
So you did get to see.
But
by that time, did you speak any English or?
Had about a year in Germany. In school, you started foreign language in the 4th grade. But it's 4th grade English. So yeah, you had a smattering of words. So it didn't take too long it's interesting. The first teacher was the television. Everyone else was busy doing stuff. You sat there in front of it trying to figure out what these words meant. But it did okay. But I joke, we spend our first few days in Brooklyn, New York, and then took the train to Cleveland, Brooklyn Township in Cleveland. So I went from Brooklyn to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Very appropriately American. So, but
and then you came to Cleveland, which would have had a big German settlement.
Yeah, actually, as probably as large as Slavic, Russian, Polish, especially Polish. In my neighborhood, you could go to a store, and if you could speak Polish or German or Russian, you could probably buy stuff. You didn't have to speak English. But it was that first generation there. Cleveland was a boom city in the 30s. You don't pay attention as a kid. You don't really realize that. And then I looked at my yearbook later, and you looked at the last names, and you go, "Didn't you notice?" Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was all German names. There were very few Italian, very few Irish, but lots of Polish and Hungarian.
That's interesting. So the Irish all came to New York and Boston.
Right. Yeah. No. Everybody. I think. Well, people went to a place they knew someone.
Yeah. I was very surprised when I was in Texas. There were German towns in Texas.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The salesman did a great job. They brought some people in. Yeah. No, there's not just. I think it's west of Austin along the lakes. There's a couple of.
There are a couple of, but it's all very German. And they immigrated there back in the 1880s because of the land. And they were farmers.
Right. There are quite a few Germans, or was it as well?
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
In Maine, up the coast.
yeah, right.
What is it?
Now, so you got here and you were in Cleveland, and so there you are, this 6-year-old.
No, 12.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so what happened to you? And what happened to your brother?
Very normal. We came. I went to grade school, which was the local church school. It was tied to, and it was a Lutheran church, and so I went to that school through the 8th grade. High school was around the corner. Went to high school, and did well enough to get some scholarships and some aid. Went on to college in Ohio, at Ohio Wesleyan, and then came east for the first time to Boston in 1966. After graduation, I entered the Peace Corps, and I was in a training program for India, some small business consulting. We had a mix of engineers and business folks. Came to Boston, went to India, came back to Boston to go to graduate school, went to BU, and then taught at a small college up in New Hampshire for a couple of years, and then came back. And this is 73, when things were tough in terms of the economy locally before the mini software business took off. Came down, I joined a company which happened to be German. They're in a job to write the local news release to the sales force. It was but the, so, well, we could never afford anything. Lexington houses there cost like $30,000 or $40,000, you know.
Gosh,
so,
yes. That was a long time ago.
Right. Then a guy in the office was being transferred, and he lived in town, and his house had been uncared for a number of years, a little 3-bedroom ranch. And now I said, yeah, but the location is good and it's got a fireplace. So that's where we moved. We're still here, you know, so.
Oh, that's great.
We needed space, just added it on, you know, but yeah.
Your mother remained in Cleveland.
Yes. Actually, she ended up dying in Lexington. No, she died in Cleveland. She came out, is another kind of one of those long stories. My mom came out to babysit the kids in the early 80s. And Linda and I went to back to India. I kind of wanted to show her where I'd worked, and I had some friends who were doing some projects. And this is before the internet and cell phones and stuff. So we were out of contact for 2 weeks. And in that 2 weeks, my mother's sister had died in Cleveland. She rushed back to Cleveland. My wife's mother came up to take care of the kids. And and then she came back from Cleveland and had a stroke here in my house, and we're still out of town.
Yeah.
I have my neighbors took over. My son, who was 8, ran across the street in panic. Oma's on the floor, you know, and they picked the hospital, they picked the doctor, they ran the services. They did a much better job than I could have done, you know.
Well, that's the strength of neighborhoods in those days.
They've all passed on, literally and figuratively, but it's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. Wow.
Your story in itself is remarkable, and your mother must have been one strong woman to have gone through all that.
Yeah. Well, it was the arrival of my first grandson, and my oldest son, when he got married, I said, what would you like? Because, you know, a family tree would be kind of interesting, because it's a mix. Ours is, you have to, each step you have to kind of explain a little bit. And I said, I'm not going to be around to explain all this to my grandchildren when they're old enough to be interested. They aren't going to be interested when they're 19. They'll be interested maybe when they're 60.
That's right.
So that I've learned that lesson. That's when I started writing. So it's been an ongoing, and the first thing you run into are regrets. I wish I had asked. I wish I had asked about this or asked about that, but it's too late. They're gone, you know.
But what I've read so far, and what you have just told us, because your story here is different than some of what I've read, you're really getting the story down, and your children and your grandchildren will really appreciate it. And we
Well,
appreciate you coming to tell us about it, because what do we know about what it was like to grow up in World War
yeah.
II?
Well, and especially I didn't say anything about that, but there were some things that happened during the war that were difficult to really be fair about at the time. The fire bombings were still, because they were mostly civilian, but Hamburg, several major cities were firebombed, and it was addressed at the civilian population, thinking the civilian population would revolt. That never happened. But the idea of them being victims was not an acceptable perspective, not till the 70s and 80s. It's interesting, there was a review of somebody saying, could you, and asked, I think it was one of the ministers, can you say you are a proud German? And no, a lot of dancing around that. To actually, and it wasn't until the World Cup, Soccer World Cup, and I think that's in the 90s, when a sense of fans displaying pride was accepted. So it's a long, long time. Yeah.
Well, I thank you for today.
Thank you.
Great that you've shared
I
this.
wandered off a bit and didn't.
No, I think that was right. It made it even more human. So thank you so much.